Good afternoon. I'm Annette Jimenez Gleason, Program Officer for Vitality, and welcome to our webinar series, The Intersection, where equity and vitality meet. Just a quick note of housekeeping. Please use the Q&A tool for your questions, and we will take questions or address questions after our speaker's presentation. And now to present our speaker, here is Jennifer Leonard, President and CEO of the Community Foundation. Jennifer?
Thanks, Annette. Let me add my thanks to our audience for your participation today. I want to welcome you to The Intersection, where equity and vitality meet, part of the Community Foundation's 2021 webinar series featuring speakers and panel discussions on issues related to our two grant-making goals of equity and vitality. Today's topic is related to our most recently adopted focus area of environmental justice and sustainability, as we welcome Peggy Shepard to present the work of We Act for Environmental Justice. Peggy is co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice, which directly engages New York City area residents in community-based planning and in campaigns that address environmental protection and environmental health policy, both locally and nationally. Peggy has successfully combined grassroots organizing, advocacy, and environmental health community-based participatory research to become a national leader in calling out that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment extends to all. Among her many accolades, she has been named co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and was the first female chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you so much for joining us today, Peggy Shepard.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be asked to talk about the work of We Act for Environmental Justice. And so I'm going to begin to share my screen and give you a few ideas about the kind of work that We Act has been doing over the past 33 years. So here's some of our members and staff at the Climate Justice March that happened in New York City several years ago. And I thought that I would begin to talk about what equality, equity, and justice really mean. There's an assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports. And that's what we call equal treatment. Everyone gets the supports they need when we talk about equity. And this is really the concept of affirmative action. So when we talk about equity, it's about getting the support you need. When we talk about justice, we all know that, for instance, we can see the game without support or accommodations because the cause of the inequity has been addressed and the systemic barrier has been removed. But there's a lot of talk about equity, which means undoing systemic racism. We know that racism is embedded, consciously or not, as a normal practice within our society and its institutions. That focuses on redlining, community disinvestment, home ownership gap, subpar schools, subpar healthcare, increased policing and incarceration, and the cumulative effects of pollution. We know that environmental racism has led to sacrifice zones, COVID morbidity and mortality, and glaring health disparities. So we really understand that systemic racism produces and perpetuates inequities in exposure to environmental pollutants. We know that over 60% of Black residents live in non-attainment areas that do not meet Clean Air Act standards, and that over 80% of Latinx residents do. We know that Black residents are almost 3 times more likely to die from asthma-related causes than the white population. Black children are 10 times more likely to die from asthma. We also know that Black households with incomes between $50,000 and $60,000 live in neighborhoods that are more polluted than the average neighborhood in which white households with incomes below $10,000 live. So when we talk about environmental racism, what we really mean is that Black communities, communities of color, and tribal communities are impacted by disproportionate and cumulative exposure to contaminants in the air, water, and soil. It puts them at higher risk of mortality and morbidity from a host of chronic disease. And we've seen that in the recent Harvard studies where Black residents died of COVID because they live in air polluted communities at higher rates than others in the population. We also understand that environmental racism is discrimination in the enforcement of laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste, the permitting of polluting facilities in communities already overburdened. And we also understand that it also excludes the voices and perspectives of people of color from the staff and boards of mainstream environmental groups, from philanthropy, from decision-making boards and regulatory bodies. So when we talk about achieving environmental justice, we're talking about a civil rights analysis of environmental decision-making. We're talking about addressing the disparate impacts of environmental pollution on communities of color. And we're talking about the lack of diversity in decision-making in green groups, philanthropy, and government regulatory setting. I'll give you an example. You're seeing a graphic of a bus shelter advertisement that we took in English and Spanish all over northern Manhattan neighborhoods. It says, if you live uptown, breathe at your own risk. Diesel bus fumes can kill. And so examples of facilities that we might find in our communities: bus depots, mobile sources from highways and bridges, sewage treatment plants, oil and gas refineries, truck traffic at fracking sites, ports and terminals, power plants, chemical plants, landfills, waste transfer sites, brownfields, and Superfund sites. These are all examples of typical polluting facilities in communities of color in New York State and around the country. So when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about addressing the disparate impacts that climate change has on communities of color, which are the first and the worst hit by climate impacts and extreme weather events. So between 2000 and 2012, nearly half of New York City's heat-related deaths were among the Black population, though the Black population is less than 25% in the city. When we talk about energy democracy, we're talking about addressing a number of potential impacts on low and moderate income folks. We understand that an important energy impact will be rising energy rates due to the energy transition. And we understand that keeping housing affordable is the way we can do that through alternative energy sources like solar, wind, community shared solar, and microgrids. And in New York City, we now have Local Law 97, which mandates the electrification of buildings and vehicles and a phase out of gas by 2035, at least 80% by 2035. We also understand that some of the impacts on climate on our communities really will focus on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And we have to ensure that when we are developing measures around mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, that these are not creating unintended consequences in terms of the impacts on communities of color. So how did I get started? This is a North River sewage treatment plant, which if any of you have driven down the West Side Highway in New York City, you will see this plant in the Hudson River between 138th and 145th Streets. The plant was initially sited on the Upper West Side, but developers lobbied the City Planning Commission to have it moved further uptown. And of course, we see this as a prime example of environmental racism. The other reason is not only because the engineers thought the best geographical location was the Upper West Side. You have to remember that uptown neighborhoods are at a very high elevation, at the highest elevation of any other community in Manhattan. And that the way our sewage system works, it works by gravity. So the extra engineering that then had to be done to move the whole sewage operations and water flow, up a hill, obviously meant that this cost more money and really provided more engineering challenges because of the topography of where it was located. So we, just to go back, we had a 6-year organizing campaign. We got the city to commit $55 million to fix what was a brand new plant because the odors and the emissions were making people sick. And we got $1 million settlement for West Harlem, for West Harlem Environmental Benefits Fund. So again, strong community support coming out by the hundreds, year after year for 6 years, finally got this plant fixed. So how does We Act do its work? That was our first organizing campaign. It was successful. And so our theory of change is that we have to organize the most affected people by the issue to engage in environmental decision-making and to help lead and identify our campaigns. So we do our work through organizing, education and training, research and advocacy. We are community-based and membership-based. We have more than 800 members who live in uptown neighborhoods. These are mostly African-American and Latinos, mostly low and moderate income. It's not helpful to simply recruit and mobilize people. They need to be informed so that they can tell their story in a way that people can hear and understand, that they have the details and the data to really talk about the evidence behind their perspectives and opinions. And so we have developed over the past 30 years with the Columbia School of Public Health, an environmental health and justice leadership training program. We now have over 30 environmental and energy and climate topics, and we can curate those topics to run trainings in schools and for other organizations who contract us to do that. We also do that for free to the community and to our members. The program runs from 6 to 8 weeks, but we can also develop 1-hour modules as well. And we are now being able, through a partnership with Tazo Tea Company, we're able to digitalize our curriculum and provide it online as well. We also have been engaged for the last 23 years on community-based participatory research with 3 research centers at the Columbia School of Public Health. And those research centers provide the data for many of our evidence-based campaigns. We're also a very strong advocacy organization with significant achievements of legislation at the city-state level, and we are now beginning to work on federal policy as well. We have started a Washington, D.C. office several years ago, and now we are working strongly with the Biden administration. Again, our federal policy office in Washington also coordinates a 50 organization coalition or network called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. We work to help them develop their capacity and to engage in federal policy decision-making. These are our 10 focus areas. We do not focus on all of them, of course, in any given year. But these are the areas that we believe make up a sustainable community from the kinds of resources and expertise that We Act can provide in our community. And right now we are prioritizing climate justice, healthy homes, sustainable land use, water quality, and toxic-free products. So what's our impact been over the years? Well, in terms of climate leadership, we serve on the New York City Local Law 97 Advisory Board, which will look at reducing emissions from buildings by 2035, 80% by 2035, and will ensure that our buildings are all electric at that point. We also have contributed to the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and we are on the Climate Justice and Transportation work groups. Right now, I am now co-chairing the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council that has submitted 100 pages of recommendations to the Biden administration on Justice 40, which is the Biden commitment of 40% of energy benefit investments going to frontline communities. We've also submitted recommendations on a new enhanced executive order on environmental justice and on a climate justice screening and mapping tool. Clean air has been a strong focus because we house over 1/3 of the city's bus fleet, and we have several bridges that are emptying traffic into our community streets. And so clean air has been a strong focus of our organization, including air monitoring and working with the Columbia School of Public Health to understand the impact of air toxins on pregnant women and their offspring. And we have been involved in that cohort study for 23 years, and the children have been followed for that amount of time. So we have had very strong research on the impact of air toxins on children's growth and development, indoor air quality issues like lead, phthalates, and BPA as well. Our work on climate justice has really been to organize at least 400 residents in uptown neighborhoods to develop a Northern Manhattan climate action plan with the community, presenting scenarios to them of, well, if this was to happen, for instance, our subway was out for 2 days because of extreme rain. What is your response? What could you do? If you had flooding in your building, what would the response by your building be? And what do you think the city response would be? And so we developed a strong plan with the focus being energy democracy. And so we've developed the Solar Uptown Now program, which leverages our worker training program, where we've trained over 1,000 underemployed people in our community around construction activities to get their OSHA cards. And we've also developed the capacity for at least 300 young men and women to be solar installers. And so they are providing the installation construction work in our solar program. We've also developed a community-based plan that led to the creation of the West Harlem Pierce Park on the Hudson River at 125th Street. And we organized a community task force that met monthly with the MTA for 6 years to ensure that the demolition of an existing depot did not impact the community when they were demolishing walls that has asbestos, and that depot reopened as the first LEEDs rated bus depot. And LEEDs is a architectural rating for excellence in energy and engineering design. We focus very strongly on healthy homes. Environmental health begins at home. We spend a lot of time there. So we've been very active with the New York City Coalition to End Lead Poisoning, and we helped to pass a strong lead poisoning standard, like Local Law 1. And just the other day, I think just yesterday, actually, in the state legislature, a bill that we've been campaigning for around lead in drinking water in schools, and that has been able to pass. We also campaigned successfully at the city council level to pass the asthma-free homes bill, which basically says that a landlord must take remediation when there is a family with an asthma condition in one of their units, and that they must inspect and really transform any kinds of asthma allergens in that home, that they must abate those issues. And so we were successful in getting that bill passed several years ago at the city council. We're also working with public housing, especially Dykeman houses in Inwood and many housing developments in central Harlem. And we're working to help public housing tenants develop a strong agenda to get the New York City mayoral candidates, to get them aware of these issues and to get their commitment to supporting some of those issues for sustainability in public housing. And so again, doing the kind of voter registration and again, working to market that platform for the New York City elections, which begin on early voting on this Saturday. And so we've been doing candidate forums and get out the vote efforts. I mentioned to you our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan earlier. Again, how do we create resilience in communities in the face of climate change? I believe that every single community in New York State should have a climate action plan, and that government and foundations should support that kind of coming together to build the resilience in every community, and so that the local governments understand what some of the challenges are in those neighborhoods. Because you might say, oh, well, it's government, they understand. Well, if government had understood in New Orleans, when they developed their evacuation or emergency management plans, they would have known that low-income people didn't have a credit card to go stay in a hotel, and that low-income people, for the most part, did not have a car to evacuate. So again, you don't understand all of the conditions that will impact an emergency situation if you don't have the perspectives of all of the people who are going to be affected in the planning. So this was part of our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. We did a graphic rendering of some of the recommendations that have been made by the community. And I realize this is very, very hard to see, so sorry for that. We know that climate change is here and impacting us. We certainly learned that from Hurricane Sandy. Many communities in New York City and upstate, of course, still not totally whole and back where they were before the impact of that extreme weather event. But we do know that we might not have those storm surge events every year, but we are going to have extreme heat events every year, and they're getting worse. And so we're working to understand and measure the impact of extreme heat on residents of Northern Manhattan. Again, we know that 50% of heat deaths in Manhattan are in African-American communities. We also know that only 50% of the 600,000 people living in public housing in New York City have air conditioning. So again, air conditioning almost, in fact, one of my research partners at Columbia School of Public Health basically says that, has basically said that air conditioning should be a prescription for some people and some families. So again, when we think about heat, health, and equity, we need to think about state policy to allow the Home Energy Assistance Program, those funds to be used to convert homes to cleaner and more efficient forms of cooling, not simply heating, but also now thinking about cooling and weatherization and energy efficiency efforts. Again, renewable energy is so crucial to keeping housing affordable and to reducing our climate footprint. And so our Solar Uptown Now program has been training underemployed workers. We've installed 415 kilowatts of solar panels on the roofs of 11 affordable housing co-ops in uptown neighborhoods. This saves more than 1,000 residents $61,000 collectively on their electric bills in the first year. And it eliminates almost 5,000 tons of greenhouse gases over the lifetime of the project. We've developed, out of the hundreds of people that we've trained, we had 12 young men who really wanted to do something more. And so we've helped them start a worker-owned cooperative. They have just completed a 9-acre solar array, which you can see down one of the graphics here. A 9-acre solar farm in Westchester. They were able to incorporate, bid on jobs, and now they're hoping to become MBE certified as well. We've also issued a green jobs report to offer recommendations on how we can diversify the renewable energy industry. Again, working on community power, solar projects on public housing. Also, some of you may have heard about renewable Rikers, removing the prison on Rikers Island and repurposing it to a solar farm and training people who have been impacted by racist policing to do solar installations and produce enough renewable energy to close the high polluting peaker plants that are in many of our environmental justice communities. So again, thinking about how we reduce emissions, again, Local Law 97 is really focused on that. Our buildings in New York City account for 70% almost of greenhouse gas emissions. So that has to be our focus. And again, communities of color exposed to much higher rate of fine particulates, and that's associated with residential gas combustion. And they face that at a higher level than others in the community. You probably have all know about the New York City school bus fleet, really retrofitting to all electric buses. That's an important, a really important initiative to ensure that kids on school buses are not being impacted by poor air quality that was coming from the diesel buses. We also are supporting an Energy Efficiency, Equity, and Jobs Act at the state legislature. And we've just worked to advance legislation that would phase out the use of natural gas in new construction as early as 2022. And we're working on a really interesting pilot project called Out of Gas. So we're partnering with Push Buffalo to launch a 6-month demonstration project where we'll monitor indoor air quality, assess cost implications, and educate tenants about the use of electric induction stoves and air source heat pumps. So the research project will be swapping out gas stoves with induction and heat pumps in 10 affordable housing homes in New York City, 10 in Buffalo, with 10 control homes in each city. And we are about to start that project in a public housing unit up in the South Bronx. We also are looking to this pilot program to inform the Better Buildings New York campaign, which is a statewide collaboration seeking to decarbonize and electrify homes and buildings throughout the state with an emphasis on phasing out natural gas. So those are some of the initiatives and projects that we have developed over the years to achieve environmental justice, to bring clean energy benefits to our communities that need them the most. And this is how you can become a member or supporter or sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Shepard. We really appreciate you joining us. And we'll move on to questions and answers. I'm Simeon Bannister, Vice President for Programs at Rochester Area Community Foundation. And in another hat, many, many moons ago, I lived in West Harlem. And, I had a chance to observe so much of the great work that We Act and that you did, Ms. Shepard. In fact, actually, want to start with just I know getting good people to collaborate with is so important, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention my friend Cecil Corbin-Mark. So can you just, maybe that's a good point of departure for our conversation this afternoon, is just how you inspired other folks to join you to collaborate around this really critical issue.
Well, our theory of change is organizing the most affected residents. And when you do that, you know, you don't have to persuade so much because you're going to people where they are and what they're affected by. And everybody wants support and assistance in addressing the challenges that are directly confronting them every day in their homes or in their building or in their neighborhood. And so, and I would also say that's reinforced because, for instance, we have a very diverse community in Harlem, as you know. We've got brownstone neighborhoods, we've got, you know, new high rises, in addition to, you know, low and moderate income folks. Why is it that we are not appealing so much to the brownstoners and the upper income folks who may not feel they have those challenges or that they can figure it out on their own? So the people we are naturally appealing to, we have membership meetings once a month where we're getting, even in COVID online, over 100 people every month. And these are all low and moderate income folks. So also the issue that, well, you know, our lower income folks are so focused on jobs and getting food on the table. Yes, they are. They're also focused on keeping their families safe.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And in that vein, I think one of the challenges is just how huge the challenges of environmental injustice can appear. There's so, it feels like there's so many areas, and that the temptation might be even be able to get into kind of the old whack-a-mole approach. How did you kind of go through the process of establishing priority areas? How did you focus the work in order to be effective?
We did kind of a focus group of community residents and asking them what they saw as environmental issues. And out of that discussion came about 17 topics. And we then looked at that and said, well, what do we have the capacity and the expertise to do? Certainly there are issues of drugs and police and of a whole variety of issues. Those aren't the ones that really address our mission. So what in our mission that the community identifies can we help support them on? And so that's how we have come to those 10 categories that I showed earlier of work, whether it's climate, indoor air, toxics, or food, or land use. Because all of those elements really go into making up a sustainable, healthy community. And again, that's what we want to be a resource on. And so we, through identification and community working groups, we have a working group that's led by community on climate justice and on healthy homes. And so now our public housing work is coming out of the Healthy Homes Working Group. And we're really being able to help support leadership in the community, help enhance their leadership skills. You know, it's just been inspiring, motivating, because what I realize is that people just need a little bit of support. They can take it on their own.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. I want to kind of play around a little bit more with this idea of engaging the community, allowing the community to kind of drive the agenda. Earlier, you mentioned participatory research that you've been able to accomplish. Do you have a sense that you've been able to accomplish that work at scale? I mean, there are a lot of people that are in the footprint area that We Act covers. How do you ensure that it's not just the loudest voices that are driving the agenda, but that it really is kind of broad-based community kind of driving the agenda?
We have 4 to 5 community organizers and staff, and that's not enough. But our community organizers are door knocking. They've even started door knocking again. Of course, we were all online during COVID, so that was a challenge. But normally, door knocking at community meetings, at every community board meeting, every month to know what those issues are, but in and out of the community at community events, and then working with our members through our membership meetings and working groups, we're really able to stay on top of the issues. Plus, a real environmental justice group is led by people who live in that community. And I live in that community. I'm a 12-minute walk from my house to my office. And my neighbors tell me every day what's going on. And obviously, I can see it for myself, whether the trash is picked up or what's going on at the subway, because I'm using all of those same services as well.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I want to remind everybody that's joined us to please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. You can also, if you need, put them in the chat. We're monitoring them, and definitely want to inform the conversation with your questions. One of those questions is about how the efforts to phase out gas and fossil fuels from buildings has been received by city officials and city departments and offices. And there's a follow-up question about how landlords are working together to electrify buildings. Any tips for success? So phasing out gas and how the city officials and city departments have received it, and then working with landlords on electrifying buildings.
So local law 97, which is a law to electrify buildings by 80% by 2035, was passed by the city council without any problems. The law is being implemented through an advisory group by the City Department of Buildings. We have hospitals and engineers and real estate. The Local Law 97 Advisory Board is very broad, with representation from all of the key stakeholders. And people are moving ahead to make that happen. The controversy is in whether you believe gas is a transition fuel or not. Many people believe it has to be. Others believe it should be phased out as soon as possible. And so that is that intersection of controversy or disagreement. But right now, I would say this is a city law, and so city agencies are addressing it. I'm not going to say that sometimes the city and the state, even though we have something like the CLCPA Act at the state level, that suddenly the state doesn't do something that seems oppositional to that legislation, that they don't suddenly give an incentive to a gas plant or, you know, that kind of issue, or approve some kind of new gas facility. I'm not saying that still isn't happening to our regret, but, and that's happened with the Biden administration as well. They've recently approved something that would appear to be in opposition to what they're saying about gas, although Biden has not issued a gas ban. So again, that's a point of contention. In terms of landlords and the phase out, I'm sure that landlords and industry are never happy about a new regulation that means they have to spend more money or do something differently. So I think that's just the bottom line. They're probably not happy, but I think the ones who are realistic and understand where we need to go to have a clean and sustainable country are buckling down and figuring out how to do it.
You've been so adept at dealing with government officials. And so I actually am curious, just to reflect a little bit more on in those instances where maybe the actions don't match up with the rhetoric, just some of the strategies, approaches, how do you kind of figure out that line between kind of collaborating and accountability?
Yeah, well, I'll say, for instance, I chair the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and I see that the city is taking some positions I don't think are good ones. And so I use my advocacy, I use my platform to advocate, try to hold them accountable. If we're not getting a good response, going more to the media, taking more direct action, whether it has to be protest or rallies or letters. You know, recently, for instance, the state is about to nominate two political insiders to the Public Service Commission who don't have any energy background. And the whole environmental community has been writing letters to the state, protesting this. And it looks like we might not get them to stop nominating those two people, but now they're nominating some people who do have experience. So I think there are ways to collaborate, but unfortunately, it just seems like we're always going to have some actions that do not fit the words and the law, at least the law the way we interpret it.
So, you know, one of the interesting questions that it begs as a kind of strategy to engage then is kind of an old one, which is strength in numbers, as it were. And one of the questions that's come in is about how upstate and downstate climate advocates can best work together. What are some potential pitfalls that could hinder that type of collaboration? And what are some of the benefits that really could be realized through that kind of collaboration, kind of adding more strength, more numbers to gain some strength?
That's a really excellent question. And, you know, we've been enmeshed in some of those, some of that dichotomy. So I think to really, so one way we're working together with state folks and city folks is around lead poisoning in schools, school drinking water. We've been working now with upstaters. I think there's some issues where that works really well because the impact is pretty even. We have a toxics coalition called Just Green Partnership, which is statewide, has over 100 groups, and is focused on toxics legislation at the state. Again, toxics, phthalates, plasticizers, these chemicals impact, impact all communities. And so you can come together on that. There might be issues like fracking. The governor said no to fracking downstate, but yes to fracking in some upstate communities. Again, that's because that's an issue that impacts our different regions a little differently. And so New York is going to say, absolutely, there shouldn't be fracking. And upstate, there's a group of people who say no fracking, but others who say, yes, we want that economic income. And so the governor listened to those sides and has allowed some fracking there. That would be a difficult, perhaps, coalition statewide with people having their differing opinions there. So I think you really have to focus in coalitions on what you have in common, what values and agenda you have in common, and focus there, because there are always going to be things that you don't agree with. We don't agree with carbon fees and cap and trade, yet we are in coalition or partnership with groups who may believe in those things. And we figure out what we can come to consensus and work together well on, and then agree that we're never going to, or we're not going to agree on some other things.
It sounds to me like setting some of those ground rules at the outset about how what kind of governs the collaboration might be a strategy that's helpful. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So kind of continuing this theme of expanding the collaboration and partnership in service of environmental justice, another questions come in about the extent to which WEAC collaborates with local labor unions. Has that occurred? Have those been places where there's common interest, or have you seen a different difference of opinion?
Well, labor unions are all different, and they have a different focus. So we have worked extensively with the transit workers over decades around the buses, because we understood immediately that the diesel fumes that were impacting the community are also impacting the workers, because they're inside the depot where these fumes are. And so working on health and safety issues, idling issues with transit workers, we've been able, when we were meeting with the MTA, to have transit workers call us to tip us off. Well, they're not really doing what they said they were going to do, and this depot isn't really doing that, or the ventilation isn't good. So we've had a great relationship there. But I would say when the negotiations come down to it, to the midnight hour, I think safety is often negotiated away with salary and benefits. I think that becomes the priority with most labor unions. And sometimes that's been disappointing, that there wasn't a stronger push on the safety aspect. I would say with the construction trades, they'll ask us to send 100 people and take 10 people. Often they do not take the African Americans, they take the Latinos, which again just creates a really negative paradigm. That's one reason. And the construction trades in New York are very dominated by certain ethnic groups that are family oriented and try to, keep the staffing or to keep the jobs in that particular, clique or team. And so that really has hindered Black and Latinos from getting into the unions. I'm very concerned about that. Some labor unions are now reaching out to talk because of the Justice 40, and they understand that more monies are going to be coming to frontline communities, and they want to be able to partner on some things. That's understandable, but still disappointing as to what would drive creating a relationship. So that's why I'm really focused on how do we think more about different ways of workers affiliating to bid on projects and to get work? Because the whole country doesn't have labor unions. The South, for the most part, does not. So when you always hear people talking about good labor jobs, half the country doesn't have labor unions. A lot of states are right to work states. So we need to talk about good family sustaining jobs, but I don't know that all of those should be addressed as union jobs, simply because we don't have unions everywhere.
Sure. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of reframing in terms of family sustaining jobs. And it really begs the question about what kind of happens next for families in the country. One of the questions that's come in, and we've been thinking a lot about this at the Community Foundation, is about the recovery dollars that are being allocated, particularly from the federal government and the American Rescue Plan Act, and then potentially in the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan. Is there any kind of current aspect of that funding that WE ACT is hoping will address some of its focus areas?
I do, but just let me say, as we're working on Justice 40, we look at the model of the PPP loans that went out that didn't get to where they were supposed to go. So we're very concerned about tracking this money, geocoding the money so that we know it exactly went to where we have identified frontline communities. And so in saying that, when I look at this American Jobs Act or other stimulus money, we've got to first start out by tracking where it goes. And when you go back to an agency and say, NYSERDA, where did all the Reggie funds go? Well, they didn't start out tracking it, so it might take them a year or two to figure it out. And then, of course, by then, maybe, more than half the money's gone, right? So we need to be able to track where that money goes. We need to have people in localities identify where they think that money should go. Because often with local government, they do an RFP and it goes to whoever can win the RFP because they have capacity or they have this or that. But it doesn't mean that that RFP really addresses the community need. And so how do we develop a new process of community identification for money coming into those communities, and then being able to hold local government responsible? We also have to understand that a lot of local government doesn't believe in climate change. I'm not talking about New York State, that you have governments in the South that no matter how much money you send will never go to a Black or Latino or Asian community. We know that money from the federal government after Hurricane Katrina along the Gulf Coast, that those monies never got to some of those Black communities who are still not made whole. So it's a huge issue with stimulus money coming that it actually gets to the people in need and not to the people who are simply better able to access it.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating idea in terms of the tracking, and perhaps that's a collaborative opportunity for some of the communities, at least in New York State. I know that here in Rochester, the foundation, we hope to be a catalyst for a lot of thinking about inclusive recovery, and certainly kind of the greening of the economy represents one of those opportunities. But having a tool that's comprehensive enough to help track those dollars sounds like that could be an important facet of cooperation.
Absolutely, and we should be demanding that agencies do that. But also, in order to monitor and hold people accountable, the big green groups aren't doing that, right? Because they're thinking nationally and they're not thinking locally. It's the local groups, and the local groups don't have capacity. Out of this, something like $24 billion in environmental philanthropy in this community, 0.5 to 1% goes to environmental justice. So right away, the only groups thinking about this have no resources or so little. I mean, to talk about monitoring, you've got to have databases, you've got to have some expertise on staff. Because even when you partner, sometimes those partners need money. Even if they're an academic institution, especially if they're an academic institution, and then they want their 60% on top, right? So, when we think about, well, why don't more people know about environmental justice? We've been doing this for 30 years. We just haven't had the resources. Resources means having a communication staff who can pump out what you're doing and pump out what needs to be done to the rest of the community. A development staff who can help you write the grants in a way that a foundation is going to say, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. I can't even read this. So you need capacity and expertise to really effectively engage. Now, we can do a lot as volunteers. And I did a lot of the WEAC work was done when we were a volunteer organization. I'm not saying that, but sustaining it for the long term, you really begin to have resources. Otherwise, those volunteers fall away and go back to life as usual.
I mean, it really is a testament to WEAC's work that it has been sustained for as long as it has. Are there some best practices that you might? I know we've got some folks that are on the call from some local environmental justice organizations here in Rochester. Any best practices for sustaining?
Well, I think first you have to have made the decision that you want to. What I'm realizing, because we have a coalition of like 50 organizations, and we started reaching out to each one. Not every one of them wants to be engaged in federal policy. Not every one of them wants to have twice as many people on staff. So you really have to understand, do you really want to have an ad hoc volunteer group that's in place to do one thing for a specified period of time? Or do you really want to institutionalize? Because if you do want to institutionalize or make that decision, then you've got to set up systems. You've got to figure out, how do I raise money? How do I meet with elected officials who are going to support me, or going to, contribute some of their discretionary funds to this? How do I, begin to write a grant to a foundation so that I can get money to hire a staff and to continue to grow that staff? So it's a very intentional decision. And then it's a business. How do I get, when we got started, the first big issue was, how do we get a phone system when we don't have any credit? I mean, just
very practical.
You're starting a business.
Yeah.
And you have to address it that way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Words of wisdom. Kind of widening the lens just a smidge here to some current events. There's a question that came in about whether there's been any progress on regulating or forbidding Bitcoin mines in New York State.
I'm afraid I don't know anything about that issue, but okay. I've not heard anything about that.
Okay.
So I think, thank you for that question. So I'll need to investigate.
I just popping in to thank everyone for being here today. Thanks to Peggy. There, I think, might be one or two more questions, but for anyone who has to leave, we just want to respect their time. Thank you again. You provide a lot of good ideas, recommendations for the work that we look to do here in Rochester. So, Simi, I don't know if there's another question or two that we wanted to get to real quick.
Sure. And I guess this will be the overtime session for those that want to hang a little bit longer. But one question was kind of really broadened the lens and asked about how air pollution, since it doesn't stop at borders between countries, and of course, this far north, Peggy, we're not too far, just a stone's throw from our friends up in Canada. But at any rate, it says, how do we connect people advocating for environmental justice within our country and people advocating for our national government to take responsibility for environmental justice in other countries?
Yeah, so for a time, the environmental justice movement had been resourced by a number of foundations to attend all of the climate talks. So I know Cecil, for instance, was WEAC's key ambassador for that. And I'm sure he went to 10 to 12 different countries over the last decades in climate talks. And what that does is you begin, generally because we're not in the big time, government meetings, we're all with the NGOs. And so we're meeting NGOs in those countries. We're having panels and meetings and discussing and meeting new people who have campaigns in those countries, and then trying to coalesce around information and data. So that's one way we have been able to do that. I tend to get delegations over the years. There might be 10 or 12 people from Japan or from Russia or from China who will stop by my office to hear about what we're doing and to kind of trade information. I get emails from people. A lot of our conferences will have people from Canada or other international folks, especially the more research-oriented conferences have a strong international diversity of participants. I think it's got to be intentional. I think if there's a group in Syracuse or Rochester or Canada or in Jamaica that has an interest in an issue, let's reach out and have a dialogue about those issues, how we can work together. There are people like the Rochester Foundation who can play a strong role in convening those kinds of discussions. I think that's a great role for philanthropy, to pull together some of those affinity groups, if you would. I mean, I know you all do that internally as grant makers, but you can also be a help in pulling together affinities between NGOs and your grantees. So I think that would be my response. I do know, for instance, I got a call one day from someone in Alabama saying, we're getting all of New York City's waste and you're environmental justice, so you tell me what you're going to do about it. Right. That's a hard one. And all we can do is continue to push for cleaning up our waste stream, for creating as little waste as possible. And then I've also been talking to the administration to say, with the climate talks coming up in Glasgow, and with your emphasis on equity, will there be an equity discussion in Glasgow in terms of the global impact of climate change? And maybe some environmental justice folks need to be going to ensure that that conversation is happening. I was very heartened to see that Biden is committed to something like buying 500 million shots of vaccine to distribute across the globe in some of the less developed countries. For instance, Africa, I'm told, is barely vaccinating people. They don't have the resources. So I'm glad to see that we're going to do that kind of work. That's how you help to operationalize equity. Because we talk again about, yeah, everybody agrees in equity and justice. Nobody will say, oh, I'm against that. But how do you operationalize it? Because then that means tough decisions. It means, where does money go? And that's when we see people say, well, it's going to take too much time to talk to all those low income people. It's going to cost too much money to look at modeling, how this would impact a frontline community. That's when the rubber hits the road. And that's what I call about operationalizing equity, because then you're making the real decisions about priorities and where the resources are going to go. That's when we know whether you believe in equity or not.
Like, I think there was a question that came in. I know the answer to this one already, about whether there's a broad range of ages of folks that participate with WEACT, and I know the answer to that is yes, and that it's young folks and folks that are seniors. So I think we'll end with the last question that came in.
Real quick though, I want to go back to when you mentioned the community organizers, and I was wondering how you engage and recruit them in the work.
Okay, so yes, we recruit them, and it's hard to recruit in the Northeast because the Northeast does not have that legacy of community organizing that you have in the West and the Southwest. So it's hard. So sometimes we have to get new people and train them. And how do we integrate them? Every one of our projects has an organizing component. So if you've heard me talk a lot about legislation, there's not a piece of legislation where we have not identified with the community that that's an issue, that we have not had them come to a lobby day, that we have not worked with them to testify at the city council or at the state. And that when we say, yes, we're going to work on a NYCHA agenda, our community organizers are knocking on doors in NYCHA to recruit people to be a part of that identification of that agenda. So we include community organizing and regular community people in everything we do as much as we can.
I mean, one of the dynamics of WEACT that was always intriguing to me, I remember standing in the back of Community Board 9 and Community Board 10, whispering with Cecil about whatever the issue of the day was. But one of the things that was always fascinating is how relevant you made environmental justice in communities of color, particularly, because it is a space, and frankly, here in Rochester, I know that many of our leading climate oriented organizations are having that conversation. How do we become more relevant in communities of color? So I want to ask for any final thoughts on that, and then also the last and very unfair question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and implement one climate solution, what would it be?
Okay. I think on climate relevance, I think the problem with climate is that it's talked about from an engineering point of view. We're going to reduce how many tons of greenhouse gases by some date, by some percent. I mean, once you hear that, your eyes glaze over. What people want to hear is, why should I care about climate change? I care about it because I'm going to have extreme heat, and my child has asthma, and that means it's harder for that child to breathe. I'm concerned because I'm in an area that floods all the time, and that means mold and other kinds of indoor air quality issues. I'm concerned because it's harder to commute, and if I don't get to my job and I'm paid hourly, I'm not going to get paid. So you really got to make it relevant to what people are experiencing. People know that in a heavy storm, there's going to be a brownout. Well, we know that some of our utilities determine what communities they're going to turn down to keep everybody else on. Generally, those are our communities. So that's why our community said we want to focus on energy justice and solar, because we don't want another brownout, which means no elevators if you live on the 30th floor in a high rise in Manhattan, or, it means no electricity and all of these things. How do we begin to have some autonomous structures that the community controls so that we are not at the whim of a brownout or a blackout in extreme weather events. So again, making it relevant. And, you know, if you ask me what was one climate initiative I would want to see, I'm going to talk about something really simple that everybody can do. Every neighborhood or every building should have a climate action plan. And in doing that, it needs to be facilitated, because sometimes, you know, it's unfair to go to somebody and say, well, what would you do if? What you want to do is say, these are some of the things that could happen. And these are some of the ways they could be addressed. What do you think might be a way to address this if it happened in your community? So you have to inform and facilitate, because you can't just say, yeah, what do you think? Somebody hasn't really thought about it, or they haven't thought about it in that way. They don't know that electricity and energy might be part of climate. They don't know that it's possible to have a microgrid or community shared solar in your neighborhood. So they don't necessarily know all of those things. And part of our job in leadership is to inform people of those emerging ideas that we all, you know, and it doesn't matter that whether you are a high school dropout or have a PhD, we don't know everything. Every PhD doesn't know anything about energy. So we've got to inform everybody and get everybody on the same page. But I think everybody should be taken through a process of understanding what impacts could happen in their community and what should be done about it, and telling that to their local government.
So
Great.
for those that are still with us, Peggy Shepard is one of our nation's preeminent activists, advocates, and translational intellectuals about climate change, about environmental justice. Peggy, thank you for being with us this afternoon. And Annette, I'll hand it over to you to take us home.
Many thanks, and I think great words to end by, Peggy. Thank you so much. And thanks for all who stayed with us. And we'll see you again at our next webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.